Good morning. Let me welcome everybody here in international organizations and NGOs, the mass media, civil society representatives. Welcome to this conference organized by the World Bank. It's called Governance for Growth with Equity in Latin America and the Caribbean. I am Menchi. I come from Paraguay. I work for the Paraguayan broadcasting agencies. It's a cold morning in Uruguay, but we have a blue sky, blue like Uruguay, that is receiving us so warmly. This is a great opportunity, no doubt, to exchange innovative ideas, to design new scenarios and anticipate tools that will help us be more accountable and do a better accounts rendering. We all know that the first enemy to governance is no doubt political corruption that oftentimes mismanages data and information and is obscene in the use of public funds. And the best antidote is to have a well-organized, empowered citizenship making the right decisions, to hold the power to make decisions and to take it away from those who are not acting with transparency. Let me now invite the people who will welcome you in this opening ceremony. But before calling responsible people, let me say something that's very important. This is useful information. Many people are asking us, how can I follow this transmission? There is a streaming by World Bank, and you can also follow the websites online. The organization, OECD, the OAS website, Inter-American Dialogue, El País from Spain, El País from Uruguay, and public television in Paraguay. Let me now invite Mr. Jorge Familiar, Regional Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean, World Bank. Welcome, Mr. Danilo Astori, Minister of Finance of Uruguay, Mr. Alfonso Prat Gay, Minister of Finance of Argentina, Mr. Santiago Peña, Minister of Finance of Paraguay, Mrs. Mariki Viñevich, OECD Deputy Secretary, ministers, representatives of civil society, the mass media, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to be here this morning with you in Montevideo with such a distinguished public to analyze a subject that is so important for our region, governance to attain a socio-economic development that is sustainable. We have not chosen Uruguay just by chance. Uruguay is a country in Latin America that ranks very high in terms of transparency and governance. And I would like to start by recognizing that not just in Uruguay, people are working in terms of accountability, accounts rendering, and governance. It's comforting to see how many reforms are underway throughout the region, and they are meant to strengthen the rule of law, accountability and transparency, and initiatives to have more solid institutions and respond and serve the citizens, and also to encourage the participation of Latin Americans in decision-making processes. Even though governance challenges are not new, today they are becoming more relevant after the deep social transformations taking place in the region. In Latin America today, there's less poverty. We have an emerging middle class, and in this context, we have a society that is more connected, that is more involved, that requires more from governments. The social transformation undergone in the region was so quick that governments have found it difficult to follow pace. And therefore it has been a challenge to respond to the growing demand for better and more public services. We are aware of the socio-economic achievements in the region that took place in different contexts. In a context where the price of commodities was high and the demand for goods was also very high. And this situation has changed. We now have been spending 5 years of economic slowdown, and we have practically gone through 2 years of economic contraction. And of course we need to recognize that there are differences from country to country in the region. But in general, we are facing factors, external factors that are much more complex. And in some cases, in some countries, there are important internal challenges to be faced that limit public resources available to really meet the key development objectives that we all share: eradication of poverty, building a society that is less unequal, to fight injustice, to preserve the planet for future generations. Even though the price of commodities and the growth of China are not under our control, there's a lot we can do to really get rid of this situation and overcome this more complex external context. But of course this will require our full participation. First of all, it will be necessary to adapt our economies to the new environment by setting the basis for future growth and protecting those who are more vulnerable. This makes it imperative for our government to use the scarce public resources more efficiently. As there's no room for complacency, the Latin America society that requires more opportunities and better public services will be called to remain active and committed and require accountability and transparency. So we can say that the subject that brings us together, governance, is the logical result of a social process in the region since the beginning of this century. Given unfavorable conditions, it is even more important to move ahead. During these 2 days of a dialogue focusing on governance and growth with equity, we will exchange opinions, we will answer key questions for the region. Among others, how fiscal transparency can help macroeconomic stability and the rendering of services. How can we face obstacles that limit transparency and accountability? Citizen participation and institutional strengthening and the rule of law. How we can tap on the potential of digital innovation and open data revolution to face corruption, to improve efficiency of public management and service rendering, and also to satisfy the growing citizen demand for participation, equity and inclusion. I invite you to take advantage of this forum to share your knowledge, experience and ideas, and get involved in an open discussion to explore the unique opportunities we have in front of us to face the challenges in the region in the field of governance and development. Such opportunities include the use of digital technology and the growing volume of research on behavioral economics and practical application. Being aware of the relevant topic that brings us together, the World Bank is ready to support the countries in the region in their respective endeavors to facilitate dialogue, exchange of knowledge by these fora. Let me conclude with a final reflection. It is desirable that all aspirations and expectations of Latin Americans will keep on growing, and that in an interconnected world such as the one we have today, we will listen to the voice of Latin Americans. Governments on a national, state and local level know that they must be more efficient to satisfy the needs of the new, very active society. Good governance, transparency, and accountability are key elements to generate trust so that all parties understand one another and work together for a common goal and the development of our region. Once again, it is a great honor to have you here. Let me welcome you and wish you a very fruitful conference. Thank you. And Minister Danilo Stoli will now take the floor.
En tanto se acerca el ministro,
While we wait for the minister, you can follow this conversation using hashtag Cuentas Clara. Good morning, thank you. Welcome to my country. I greet you on behalf of the government and the people of Uruguay. In particular, I bring special greetings from President Tabaré Vázquez. He would have liked to join you this morning, welcoming you in person, but due to his very tight agenda these days, he was not able to come this morning. We would have liked to welcome you with a more pleasant weather and a feeling of more comfortable temperature, but the weather conditions tell us that climate change is here to stay. And this has a lot to do with the subjects that we are going to study and discuss during this conference. Let me greet the authorities of the World Bank in particular, and without going into detail, I would like to ask you to allow me to address the person of the Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean. And let me tell him that we are very honored for having been selected to host this conference. I would like to greet my colleagues Alfonso, Santiago. We will share a panel shortly and we will reflect on several issues. We will exchange ideas as Jorge already anticipated. In this quest for a goal which is a permanent quest in the region, as we try to get higher economic and social development, the very positive interconnection of institutional strengthening, transparency, accountability, governance. This is the subject that we should analyze from a structural point of view. This is essential for our societies. The volatility and uncertainty have reached this region, and this is the reason why the topic has to be enriched, shared, and discussed. I think that this stage of difficulties we are presently undergoing at our different countries should encourage us to keep on searching, to study more in depth and to analyze more in depth all the ideas that we will share so that we may reach useful conclusions, conclusions that are valuable for our societies. We'll talk about law and legislation. We'll talk about different things according to the program we have for all the panels. I'm going to use an expression now that comes from the World Bank report. That's an Anglo-Saxon expression, the rule of law. And we will talk about the role of law. And in this search, in this quest, the institutional analysis becomes the protagonist. And we won't be able to leave it aside. The program also anticipates analyzing specific cases, and tomorrow, in particular, we'll talk about the future outlook, the development in future, stemming from this relation between fundamental concepts. The agenda is open, nevertheless. It's open for two reasons. One was mentioned by Jorge. We cannot ignore the differences existing in the framework of things that bring us together or make us seem alike. However, there are specificities and differences in our different societies because we have different histories or different identities, and therefore they deserve a specific type of analysis. That is why our agenda is open. The agenda is open because it's a never-ending agenda. It's an agenda that includes topics that require permanent analysis, permanent work. We will never be able to say that we have reached the best stable formula, that we have reached a solution that will stay over time. We will always realize that the agenda is open and requires working on it. The day we are self-complacency and believe that we have finally reached a definite conclusion, that day will be a failure. That is why, under this conviction, I reiterate my gratefulness. Thank you for having chosen Uruguay to host this meeting, and I wish you all a very fruitful activity and rich conclusions so that we can move forward in the framework of this open agenda. Thank you very much.
Nuestro agradecimiento.
We thank Minister of Economy and Finance of Uruguay, Mr. Danilo Astori. We will now invite the ministers to this panel, to this round table on governance and economic development in Latin America. I will invite the moderator, Mr. Jorge Familiar, and the panel members, Danilo Astori, Minister of Economy and Finance of Uruguay, Santiago Peña, Minister of Finance of Paraguay, and Alfonso Prat Gay, Minister of Treasury and Public Finances, Argentina. In the programs, you will find the bios of our different guest speakers, and I want to save time. I'm not reading the bios, but you can read them in your folders. So let me now introduce the moderator. Jorge Familiar is the Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean with the World Bank since May 2014. He leads relations with 31 countries, and the vision is to eradicate extreme poverty and promote prosperity by creating opportunities for all Latin Americans. In the World Bank, he also worked as Vice President and Corporate Secretary and member of the Board of Directors. He was also Director General of the Institute for Consumption of Workers, a financial institution in Mexico that was committed to family inclusion, and he started working in Mexico. So we will start with the first ministerial panel on governance and economic development in Latin America.
Good morning again, and thank you very much. Minister Astori was saying that these microphones never work, and he was partly right. Good morning to everyone again, and we will start with a very special panel, as you can see here. We have 3 ministers of finance of the region of countries that are fully committed to the subject that gathers us here today: governability, transparency, and accountability. We have the intention of having a very interactive conversation with you. We have some questions with which we would like to open the conversation, but we would really like to have this session be a question and answer opportunity. On my left, I have Minister Alfonso Prat from Argentina, who recently surprised the world with a very successful issuance in the international markets, thanks to the efforts of President Macri's government to present Argentina in the international community. Of course, we have our host, Minister Astori, who, as I said before, represents the country that leads the ranking of accountability and transparency in the region. And we have Minister Santiago Peña from Paraguay, who is a country that has sought to make a difference and show a clear trend to improve in aspects of transparency and accountability. Ministers, I would like you to please talk to us about three things. The first one is, why is transparency and accountability important to generate development and sustainable growth? That would be the first issue. And the second one, what are your governments doing? What are you doing as finance ministers concerning this subject, and why do you think it's important? And the third point is there such a thing as too much transparency, or should we seek the right balance? Is there any risk, for example, in us taking control as monitoring mechanisms to a degree that they could generate paralysis in decision making and even in negotiations that are necessary to do public policy? Why not, Minister Astori? Maybe you can start sharing your ideas. Thank you very much. I will use as a basis something I've just said and that you have also mentioned, Jorge, and this is this virtuous chain between institutional strengthening, transparency, accountability, governance of development. And I will make a very brief analysis, but a regressive one, stemming from the need of development to be a project for the medium and long term that requires an absolutely strategic outlook, a national project that is not the project of a partisan social force, but of the society as a whole. And we're talking about the construction of better life conditions for our population, and specifically for those who have been farther away from dignity in the life conditions. And so in this strategic search, there are guidelines that have to do with the objectives being sought and the path that is chosen to achieve those objectives, and the instruments of policy that are selected to ensure precisely the route to these aims. Using instruments is just managing power to serve those objectives. And in this search, there are fundamental guidelines that should stand beyond the specific differences in our countries, the fundamental direction. And we have said it with different words. Inclusive growth, that is growth that is achieved by recognizing the rights of the population and not just assistance, is one of these guidelines. And an opening to the world is another one. An opening that has been growing in Latin America. Let's not change my theory that these are the ones that work and the others don't, because I would be contradicting my own proposal. So, an opening to the world which has been growing with difficulties, but it has grown in Latin America. The search for quality conditions is an inherent aspect of this opening to the world, and these represent examples of a true cultural transformation to reach higher levels of development for our population. And when I say cultural transformation, I am thinking about a universalistic cultural concept by which development is not just growing and ensuring inclusion and opening to the world and betting on quality, but it is specifically learning to live life in a different way in our societies. A cultural development where we assume that we are different, that in our societies there are important diversities that we accept, and we transform them into a creative diversity, and along the way we stimulate the growth of self-esteem, collective self-esteem, by reaching objectives of development and respecting values such as solidarity, altruism, tolerance. Development is all of that. It's an integrated, holistic concept. And this can be achieved not by miracle, not as a gift, and not as an inheritance. And you achieve it by doing policy in the highest and broadest meaning of the word. Policy, not as a partisan concept, although I will say something about parties now. Doing politics is when a society proposes aims such as the ones that we have mentioned, the paths to reach those aims, and the instruments that are necessary to implement them. And that is doing politics. And as we can increase the quality of politics, we will be able to increase this virtuous chaining with which we started these comments and these statements. And there is no quality politics without a good party system. Of course, there is no governance without finding precisely the orientations that will rise above the parties and at the same time above the alternance of governments in power. Having strong parties with access and internal democratic functioning, with a hierarchy of the activities of analysis and programming, and with a lot of discipline, understood as those three great moments, that is the democratic discussion of the issues, the democratic resolution, and disciplined acceptance of the decisions of the majorities. That's how you build strong parties. That's how you do quality politics. And by doing quality politics, we will be sowing good seeds to face together in society a path toward development. And that's why we talk about governance. What is governance? Governance is ensuring conditions of sustainability for the governments that are leading the country towards these highest levels of economic and social development. And that, I reiterate, cannot be achieved without politics and without the minimum basic agreements that, beyond parties and governments, will allow us to reach those objectives. I don't know in the world, to be honest, any successful experience that has progressed based on discrepancy or disagreement. I do know successful experiences where a shared route has been planned from different political opinions, and that route has been set above the differences, and it has established strategic guidelines that have been respected in the society as a whole for long periods of time, because we are talking about experiences of long duration in our societies. And this brings about, and in a way it is implicit in your triggering questions, it brings to the table the issue of the transformation of the state, because you cannot talk about strong parties, hierarchy, politics, governance, without mentioning the democratic transformation of the state. This transformation requires doing away with prior confusions that we have suffered in our country, believing that public is a synonym of collective, believing that private is a synonym for individual is another confusion. Confusing the public space because it leads us, as many times we have fallen in Latin America, to a state-centric conception where the government dominates public issues, where actually the public space is a much broader concept than the concept of state or government, and it comprises it. There are increasingly more space of the public space that are outside the government limits. The society increasingly seeks, sometimes successfully and sometimes in failure, ways to approach the public space with independence from government. And this topic has to do with a reform that has at least 4 essential planes. One, first of all, the one that is considered in this call, the institutional strengthening, which in a development process means 2 things: the modernization of the institutions and the strengthening of them, so that they really become aspects that will make a contribution to the final aim. In the second place, the development of human capacities, which is fundamental for reflection that we have undertaken with this panel and those coming after it. In the third place, technological development, which Jorge mentioned. That will put within our reach in the digital age the mechanisms to strengthen transparency, accountability, and ultimately governance. And fourthly, management issues that cannot be left outside a reflection like this one, and which cannot become the axis of the analysis of the public state issues, because many times we identify the interests of this analysis on management when it is only one of the aspects that we should focus on in the discussion. And I will end by pointing out where we have focused, at least in Uruguay, from the point of view of the strengthening of the institutions in light of the concepts that bring us to this meeting. First of all, we have stressed institutions that favor access to information, and there are 3 fundamental processes: the search of information, the reception of information, and the spread of the information. These 3 aspects are absolutely essential to strengthen the conditions of transparency and control of the society and of accountability by those who lead the fates of that society. In the second place, data protection, which is a fundamental counterpart of any process of deep access to information. And Jorge, maybe one of the aspects that should be considered in the last point that you mentioned, that is the search for balances, right? Between transparency, accountability, and political agility that public management requires. And this is an aspect that we have been very careful in Uruguay, and there are institutions that are directly addressing access to information and data protection. And I would like to mention specifically also a good public acquisition system, procurement system with legal certainty, which is very important in this search. And today we were talking about opening, how not to search for institutions like this one without considering international participation. And here there are processes in which Uruguay has progressed a lot, such as the exchange of information, tax information, the identification of asset holders for companies that used to be anonymous previously and which are important for these aspects that we are working on. Uruguay has progressed on these aspects, and of course there's a lot of work to be done, and we should deepen our analysis about the next steps to be given by taking advantage of these opportunities, where we will most likely find very useful reflections and the defense of concepts that are important for continuing the progress in these aspects.
Nos destaca el fortalecimiento.
You highlight strengthening institutions, technological development, improving public management, access to information, exchange of information. Alfonso, many things are happening in Argentina. How important is accountability and transparency in your country now as part of this process where great change is taking place? First of all, Jorge, thank you for this invitation. Danilo, thank you for your hospitality. We are from the club of special people, so we'll see how we do in this field. Let's talk about these issues. It's a good opportunity. There's not much to be discussed. The point is how to put it into practice. In such a panel, it would be hard for someone to admit, I don't want transparency. The problem is how to put it into practice. And I will start with the logo that you have chosen for this conference. The logo and the motto, cuentas claras, clear accounts. We say clear accounts keep your friends. So if we translate this into the public field, clear accounts ensure coexistence, living freely. We cannot imagine rule of law without transparency. I like the logo that shows participation of people. We are talking about transparency, participation, and accountability. Taking up what Danilo said, for some reason that term does not exist clearly in Spanish. What you say accountability in English, we have to put several words together to say rendición de cuentas. It's hard to explain, and there is a reason why. Anyway, I'm talking on behalf of a government that had to be in charge of a very complex situation in this field. Uruguay was the first in the region in terms of transparency, and we are the last, according to last year's data. So the alphabetical order is reversed here in the case of transparency. We are 1 out of 4 countries in Latin America that has not approved a law to access information, and the 4 countries are Costa Rica, Bolivia, Venezuela, and Cuba. With the exception of Costa Rica, we could make a few comments, but I'm not going to make those comments now. Argentina, when Néstor Kirchner started his administration, a decree was passed relative to access to information. The decree already led to 5 rulings of the Supreme Court saying that the government violated its own decree. So this is the starting point we have in Argentina. In other words, transparency or lack thereof is a historic debt in Argentina. Jorge, you mentioned how we solved one of such debts. The country has too many debts to face, and transparency is one of such debts. And we must face it, remembering that transparency is not a dream, it's a reality. It's a reality we can build together. And being dark, that's not a curse. For a long time, we thought that the government had to be silent and quiet and not share information because of difficult reasons. And that's not true. And these people now are requesting us to open up. Our people, the government, the President Macri's government, he said it when he opened ceremonies 1st of March. The banner of the new government is to be transparent in all public acts. We have started a national portal with government data. It's called datos.2.ar. So you can find out about my declaration of assets, as well as the declaration of assets and disclosure of assets by many other public servants. It's good information for kidnappers, but we thought it was good to have this level of transparency. You will have details about our contracts, organization charts, budget. We will upload our agendas and our interviews in an effort to rebuild what was not done for a long, long time in Argentina, something that was obscenely disregarded in recent years. The debt, in terms of transparency, affects everybody. It's not just a feeling that we have a group of government people who work without sharing information. Working in the dark, you may be closer to corruption. If you put everything on the table, it's very difficult to hide things. Corruption is connected to plundering and really using or misusing public resources. If you keep money, this generates anomia, which is so common in my country. So why meet legislation requirements if those who are responsible can do whatever they want to do and nothing happens? So this affects the rules for coexistence, and this anomia leads to corruption. And this squandering of resources cannot lead to economic development and social inclusion. All the wasted resources could have been used to more noble objectives, which are not the objectives of certain civil servants who want to work in isolation. And in Spanish we say, let the light shine, so that things are clear, so that you see what's going on. So this is the ongoing discussion. And then I will make a few other comments, because I think we'll have time. And this microphone is really working. So, apart from the portal, in Argentina we are also trying to do other things. Jorge mentioned negotiating the debt. That is a precondition. It's not a goal. It's a precondition. It's a point of departure. Argentina was for 15 years out of the contact with the rest of the world. And we were doing default for a long time as well. We were not transparent, and that is why we did not comply with our own Supreme Court. And we believe that one of the reasons why, or one of the steps we had to take to become credible again, as we opened to the rest of the world and as we faced our own countries, we had to comply with the promissory notes that we had to pay, that were pending. And this was what surprised everybody when we decided to do that, to meet our commitments. It seemed to be so difficult. Argentina was in default for such a long time with no access to markets, and suddenly we have $70 billion who want to buy bonds from Argentina. I have read foreign portals, and 80% of the opinions is what happens to the world. The world is lending money to Argentina now. What's going on? And we're very much aware of this point of departure. We're so much aware that in all we're doing so far, we have, if I may say so, because I have my own opinion, and this will be discussed later, we have to be careful with an excessive transparency. I don't think that we are experiencing an excessive transparency. And let me illustrate this. When we decided to negotiate with the judiciary, the creditors who were expecting this situation said, let's sign an agreement for confidentiality. And the lawyers said, well, this is common practice. But very important leaders from other governments told us, well, these things can be solved in a framework of confidentiality, otherwise you cannot negotiate. Well, we are not going to accept it. There's no reason why we should negotiate in the dark. Even less so when we were middlemen of the Congress of the Nation. You understand, Jorge, what I'm saying? As representatives of the nation, we could not negotiate something in a closed room. And this took us 2 weeks. That was record time. In 2 weeks, we discussed whether to sign an MDA or not, an agreement for confidentiality. And the line of the president was, no, we will not sign an agreement for confidentiality. So when we shed light on the table, we were not the bad guys. It was clear. It was very clear that the problem was in the hands of the person who had to confirm how such revenue was accumulated. And so in the past, it was better to do that in confidentiality, but not today. This is a specific example, Jorge. And you see this in many other fields. For example, in how the National Institute for Statistics and Census works in Argentina. This institute, for 8 years systematically, was exclusively devoted to lying. A national body with many workers, with budgetary resources, we asked them to measure and publish figures, but in the end they did the opposite. So what did we do? We gave them absolute independence to Mr. Jorge Todesca, who is in charge of this institute, and he's organizing things, and we are beginning to see figures and numbers. When INDEC published figures for the GDP for last year, the estimation was much higher than we expected. And this was playing against us, even at the time when we were discussing opening up to the market with a special bond. And I'm not going into details now, but at the point we said, don't complain. This is the value of being free and transparent. There's no doubt that this is not appropriate, but this is what we chose. We want accounts to be clear, and we want to have good accountability. Other examples of lack of clarity, which are in the focus of public opinion in Argentina today, are the role of that position where we have to be secret, the fiscal secret, but we had some authorities of the collection body that tried to hide information from certain people and to go after those who oppose them. Next week, these authorities will have to render accounts. So, independence of the judiciary is beginning to reactivate itself. So in order not to go too much in depth, so that this will give you time for questions. It's clear that the decision of Macri's government is to cut from the past and start anew, to honor our debts, to be transparent, and to do all that is needed to regain credibility. The National Government Data Portal is a point of departure. We are going to submit a new law in Congress that has to do with access to information. There is a bill of law for a law to coordinate propaganda in the different mass media. This is for advertising, and this is important. The role of the media in procuring transparency. And we understand that in this exercise to rebuild trust, the first step is to be truthful, to tell the truth. It's no good lying, because we fool ourselves and we also fool the rest of the people. In my own case, every time I had a public responsibility to undertake, my criterion was that nothing is secret. And the journalists who are here in this room know me. If there's nothing to hide, there's no reason for me to hide it. And this should be a motto. If halfway there we find an oxymoron, an excess of transparency, we'll discuss it. I may understand that there may be an excessive supervision, an excessive regulation, but I don't like excessive transparency, especially when we talk about public issues. We are responsible as civil servants in any hierarchy, in any jurisdiction, national, provincial, municipal. We have to be very careful, and we should face things. So the point of departure of any democracy or democratic coexistence and development starts with the truth in a dialogue, in transparency.
Alfonso, we will keep some of your reflections. Clear accounts are essential for democratic life. Opacity is a matter of corruption. Transparency is a public debt. And thank you very much for sharing with us those very specific examples about how transparency adds value in complex values such as the negotiation of the debt. Santiago, many things are happening in Paraguay. We have talked a lot about the progress in terms of transparency and accountability. What can you share with us? It is a pleasure to be here with us to share with Danilo and Alfonso. First of all, to congratulate the World Bank for preparing this event in this place in Uruguay, which has been for us South Americans an example of progress in governance, transparency, and I think that it is fairly reflected in the international transparency indexes. The public should be public. President Carter in 2012, somebody from outside politics mentioned everything public should be public. And that sounded nice, like a campaign slogan, without a lot of meaning, without understanding what was behind it. And that year Paraguay grew at a rate of 14%. So it wasn't necessarily the answer to an economic situation, a discouraging situation. Uruguay was very prosperous, it was growing at very high rates, but it was understood that that macroeconomic stability that had been built was not enough for this shared prosperity, a concept that the World Bank has established in all our economies, and I think it is very important. One of the first measures, actions, is if we want to have shared prosperity, we should have consensus in society. And that starts work in August 2013 of a government took office of about a year and 2,000 leaders of civil society to build a shared view of the Paraguay that we want. And that was reflected in a development plan with 3 axes, the reduction of poverty and the insertion of Paraguay in the world, and its inclusive development. Citizen participation is essential. Paraguay doesn't only have a young population, it has the youngest population in Latin America, 75% under 40 years old. I'm a representative of this group, and thank you for reminding us. But it was a key aspect if we wanted to have an inclusive growth. Inclusion had to be a participatory element. And so we started to develop initiatives that have generated, we feel, what we feel is a revolution in Paraguay. In the last 2 years, I'm coming from bureaucrats in the central bank, and for central bank transparency is key to conducting monetary policy with a long-term view. And this is a concept that has been shared throughout the public sector. The president is sent, one of the first actions was a law of access to public information, and that was the beginning of the process. And the next month, all the salaries of the public officials started to be published. Every one of the salaries of public office officials is being published monthly. And this has brought as a consequence public scrutiny and without parallel. And this has brought a lot of marital problems, a lot of spouses that have found out how much their spouses are earning. But this has generated a series of reforms that allow us to have a much more efficient public management. And the concept that we understand through this is that human beings are good by nature, but when we are controlled, we behave much better. So this has allowed salary assignment in the public sector to be much more open, and the citizens have started to act, and students in some cases have requested the dismissal of public officials because they have found of problems in the salaries of public professors, public university professors, and also other types of government officials. And so there's a revolution underfoot, but the results are very encouraging, and some of these results, and this means a support for the management of the Ministry of Finance, which is always a very difficult responsibility, that we have to collect taxes and we have to distribute them, and it's never enough for everything. So transparency is a big ally in the assignment of those very limited resources. We have seen the growth of salary mass, which has always been a point of instability, it has stopped being so. There's practically a stagnation in terms of growth, reaching only 5% in the last quarter. We have seen that the composition of public expenses has also been readapted, less current expenses and more in social programs. And this has allowed us, in a situation of economic deceleration, to the management of the public sector to offer that vulnerable sector that is affected by economic deceleration. We have had public management that is much more efficient. I was saying that we started this initiative in 2013. Nobody could forecast that the change in external conditions would have an impact with this of the magnitude that we are seeing today. We have been hit hard regionally, as Brazil has a deceleration that has an important impact. So we see that these transparency measures, these accountability measures, access of information have been the main allies in the public management to be able to respond in a more efficient manner. And the big question is, which is the balance? I share with what Alfonso said. We should go to the extreme of more access, even to the risk that it implies important effort, both political and social. We have to understand that previous governments and previous regional situations did not open the accounts because it would have an important political cost. But now we understand that this access of public information, accountability. Citizen participation is an asset, and it should not be there should be no return from it, so that the citizens can access and use that access in an effective manner. We are using that for the entry to public functions roles. This has been one of the big challenges in Paraguay. What other mechanisms are these? Transparent? Do all citizens have opportunities? Nowadays, all the hirings are done through calls through the technological platform. We have also perfected the procurement systems. We have launched a plan of fight against corruption. There have been innumerable initiatives. There's a lot to be done still. There's a huge challenge for all our countries, and clearly for Paraguay. It is not just a matter of generating information, but for that information to be translated into effective penalties. And we should understand that we have this reality, we live in this reality where citizen frustration is concentrated on the executive. They understood that the executive is not just the administration body, but it's also the one that passes the laws. And we have this big challenge of generating more citizen participation and creating this, but respecting the roles of each of the institutions. The judicial should be in charge of enforcement of the law. The legislative should pass the laws that benefit the citizens and the use of public resources in general. So I would like to be brief now and to open the discussion. Jorge, I think this is an issue where we have a lot to learn. This is something, it's a current that all of the countries are going through, and this will have an important dividend, and it will be that our political models of this democracy that is becoming consolidated in Latin America is much more sustainable and in the long term. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Santiago, for sharing the evolution and change with the public information law in Paraguay, both in the public and family environments. And remember your phrase, human beings are good by nature, but when we are controlled, we behave even better. You know who said that, among others? General Perón would say that. General Perón in Argentina, he said human beings are good, but if we control them, they are much better. And he's the youngest Minister of Finance in the region. I was very poor in moderating. I could not interrupt them, but I would like to take 3-4 questions from the audience and then come back to the panel members and ask them to respond. We have a question over here. If you could bring them a microphone, please. Good morning. Let me welcome the 3 ministers from the economic area. It was a pleasure listening to you because I get the feeling that we are changing. There's an important change taking place. You have mentioned the law to access information. You have mentioned procurement, state procurement. You have talked about salaries, and I ask you, what is the role in government accountability when the transparency manual of the IMF says without a reliable government accountability there is no transparency in public accounts? So what is the role you play? I'm an accountant. I'm a fanatic accountant. What can we give you as accountants? Accounting is a management activity, and we can help you. There are many accountants from all over Latin America here. We have the representative of IFAC here. We have the Professional Council of Accountants. The accountants are not boring. We will not bore you. We will help you. So what is the role that we can play in your governments? Well, I am an accountant. Let me make this point clear. There's another question over here. Please go ahead. Thank you. I'm Alfredo Cruz Polanco, member of the Accounts Chamber in Dominican Republic. Congratulations for your presentations. I have a question. In all our countries, we have passed transparency, accountability laws or anti-corruption laws. Don't you think that we need to apply a scheme to deal with consequences? Because we still participate, we hold conferences and meetings and seminars, but in truth, we don't take off. We need each country to really implement those brilliant laws and legislation, because the citizens are expecting us to implement a mechanism that may stop corruption and poor management of our resources that could be used in other areas that are more necessary. And we have another question over here. If you could pass the mic. Good morning. I'm Guillermo Montenegro, Argentine ambassador in Uruguay. I work in the judiciary. That's why my question is how to investigate corruption cases. Corruption is a transnational crime. I know what President Macri thinks, but wouldn't there be a need to create an inter-American and Caribbean court to fight organized crime so that it has a capacity to do investigation and to punish this type of corruption and crime? Many times international treaties do not act very promptly, and therefore investigations are not promptly carried out, and we cannot fight corruption. We have many questions. I will only add one more, and then I will ask the panel members to respond to such questions. You'll need another type of microphone. I'm Marta Ferrara, director of an organization called Seeds for Democracy in Paraguay. I want to talk about the Paraguayan experience of the civil society in a process when the law of access to public information was worked on. Different organizations of the civil society got together to help for approximately 10 years to elaborate this law. And we presented ideas on several occasions. There was no quorum until two years ago, when we received funds from different donors like USAID. In the end of the process, the organizations presented a bill of law to the Senate through a group of senators that created a committee on legislative transparency and ethics. They presented this bill of law, and in the end it suffered some slight modifications, others not so slight, but we have a text that was approved by the executive branch. This was a very rich and shared process where the organized civil society played a fundamental role. Thank you so much. So, ministers, we have 4 questions. The role of government accountability, the implementation of law, the need for an inter-American court against organized crime, and the participation of civil society in the preparation of new legislation to ensure transparency. Who would like to start? I think the questions are all very relevant. I will start by answering the first one. When we discuss access to information, there are 2 things we need to be clear about. One is access per se, having instruments or regulations and procedures, and the second is to have information. The two things are necessary. If we build an institutionality that tends to broad access, and I agree with Alfonso and Santiago that I don't believe in excessive transparency. We have to be careful. I don't believe in an excessive transparency. But if we don't have basic information available, it's going to be very difficult to put things into practice. And this goes hand in hand with another question, the implementation of decisions made in this sense. The adoption of the most modern and specialized accounting standards is decisive, so that these ideas that we are analyzing today can be implemented. It's a basic requirement, a sine qua non requirement, as important as the basic standards ensuring access. And here the colleges, the professional colleges, have a very important role to play. They should foster, disseminate the importance of basic information and how to access this basic information, and also improving methods to elaborate and build that information, and then disclosing that information to those who should implement it. So I connect this comment to the implementation and application of standards that are more transparent. This has to do with the possibility of having accurate information. Alfonso today talked about the changes taking place in Argentina in the elaboration of statistics. And they need to recover credibility. It will take time, but this is fundamental. We talk about accounting information, which is different from this other information, but as important as the first one. And also, the ambassador from Argentina suggested the creation of international bodies, such as the one he suggested at the Inter-American level, and I share this idea with him. I fully agree with that, because we are now facing an international trend which is expanding crime, very serious crime that relates to corruption like money laundering, and of course how it relates to organized crime and terrorism. And national legislation is not enough to combat this, because the power of such corruption is transboundary. It has become transnational. It's the most dangerous transnational activity. It's negative, and it's negatively powerful. That is why anti-money laundering legislation becomes especially relevant at the level of institutions in our countries. And we need to have them to operate against these trends. Alfonso. Thank you, Jorge. Let me second Danilo, and of course let me second the proposal raised by Guillermo, who knows a lot more than we do about this topic. Given traceability and transboundary action of these crimes, we need to have peer pressure in a group that allows us to act correctly. If we are not acting correctly, those who suffer from this misbehavior have somewhere to resort to. This transboundary action of corruption is very relevant at the level of G20. You know that Argentina miraculously was a member of G20 for the last 20 years. And we are now recovering this link. And within G20, we discuss fiscal transparency, automatic exchange of information, and standards to combat money laundering and terrorism funding. We are looking for new standards. In the last meeting of the G20 in Washington, in the press release by presidents of central banks and governors, there are 2 paragraphs referring to the need to move on to identify the end beneficiaries of different structures in fiscal havens. There is some progress made at the level of G20 in terms of economic institutions, and Guillermo is suggesting to move into the legal institutions, so the format is more aligned to this, making it enforceable. I think that the more institutions we have requiring this type of control, the better it will be. Now, regarding how to enforce the law, we have good laws, but if the law is not enforced, what's the point? I think that in the next panels and sessions, you will talk about this. You will talk about the role of control institutions and bodies. Control and regulatory bodies have a play to role. We need to do this. And then sometimes over time we have people who take the position, but they are not involved and they don't do what they are expected to do. So being transparent, as this gentleman says, first we need access to information, then we need oversight bodies or control bodies, because not accessing information has a cost. And of course, we need to have independent judiciary. Without that, our discussion would be useless. Useless. Interesting, but in most cases, useless. Now moving into the question relative to accountants. I'm an economist, so I always have trouble with the accountants and with the lawyers, of course. I have problems with 90% of professionals. Well, logically, why logically? I'm not clear. I'll tell you about our negotiation with the lawyers in New York. I'll write about that sometime in future. But I'll take this question and let me talk about a fundamental institution which we need to emphasize. That's the national budget. And I'm talking about the national budget because my government for 10 years put everything in the national budget. For 4 years, I was the opposition and I had to fight this budget discussion. There was no discussion, in fact. What's more, we and my team of collaborators, we presented a national budget project which was alternative. We presented it every year during 4 years. That's a very unique case because the opposition generally does not have elements to put a budget together. But we did it nevertheless. With this, my point is that the time has come for us to move on. I don't know if this is the case of Uruguay and Paraguay, but an institution like in the States, that is an independent office that evaluates the budget. That's a very important office. It makes the budget discussion more transparent. The budget conveys in numbers the priorities of a government. The mic is off. Okay, which is the best microphone then? I was saying in a national budget you express in numbers the priorities of your government. So we need all the elements in order to discuss the information that Danilo mentioned. We need the right information that is not partisan. We need to explain what each project in the budget means, what is going to be the fiscal, economic, social, environmental impact of that. In Argentina and in most of our countries, we do not have such an office to evaluate in a democratic and transparent way important questions such as budgetary decisions. This exceeds accountants, lawyers, and economists. Santiago.
The role of public accounting is key. I'm totally convinced that Paraguay was the last country in South America that went open in the markets, and 2013 was the first issue, and of course the level of scrutiny of public accounts is huge. And I can imagine, Alfonso, that you probably had that situation, and that investments need to measure risk, and so they need information. So public accounting is the key, and I think there's been a lot of progress at the level of the World Bank. In the case of Paraguay, the World Bank has helped us with the model, the SPIR model, that allows to having access to all the information. And I think we're making progress on an aspect that is how to generate this control in line with what Alfonso was saying, an independent control of public accounts. We're advancing in the creation of an independent group in the public sector that will look at the public accounts and issue an independent opinion about. These are models that Anglo-Saxon countries have developed it. I think that Canada is the one country that has developed it the most, and we're just starting, first by bringing a group of experts with a lot of experience in the private sector and experience in the public sector that can accompany and say where things are being done right and which things should be improved. And this is important for figures to reflect reality and the role of accountants. It's extremely important. And when I argue with the lawyers, they say forget it, because economy is an ancillary science to law. So I lose that discussion, and they know. And the proposal of Alfredo Cruz of Dominican Republic about the consequences, that's where it's fundamental to explain the role of each of the institutions I mentioned. There's a big frustration that is generated by the abuses within the public administration, and many times that frustration is focused on the executive branch. The citizen thinks that the executive is the root of all evils, and there are institutions that have the role. We have to understand the role of each one. Last year, Congress dismissed 2 controllers of the government because of lack of publication of salary information. Unfortunately, the parliamentary process for the appointment of the new controller has not been finished. Public hearings have been held. Over 100 candidates have been interviewed, but Paraguay hasn't had a controller for the Republic since last year. There's a person that is working as a substitute in a function that has a very important institutional role. The same thing with justice. The judicial has a very important responsibility. Once the cases of mismanagement of resources have been identified, there should be an immediate punishment. That is very bad when it doesn't happen. And I think that at the Latin American level, we are also analyzing how we can have a more efficient, less costly justice. And this is one of the big challenges, to go further in what we were saying about the rule of law, because it's not just a matter of having a law, but enforcing it and making sure that this law is complied with. What the Argentine ambassador was mentioning, and I totally agree with him, that the central countries are advancing very quickly in terms of controls. We see what's happening nowadays in money laundering practices and have an impact in our countries with the flow of currencies and increasing controls and legal actions, and the legal organizations are looking for the jurisdiction that with the more lax environment for setting up business. And we have to understand that these are transnational operations, and the reality is that South Americans have a lot of progress to make in the integration. This exercise that Mercosur has been in the last 25 years has taught us a lot, but there's a lot of progress to be made. There has been some advancement, but the path and the integration process has to become real, not only economic and in trade, but also a much deeper integration in other environments, political and social environments, which would lead us to have this access to this type of information. In Paraguay, unfortunately, had a very unfavorable experience in 2012. It was punished by its peers. We think it was unfair, but I think these lessons help us progress in the creation of institutionality. This crime is transnational. The drug trafficking is a huge problem that all of our countries are going through, so the response has to be a coordinated effort. And the last point, Marta, to Ferraro, my compatriot, I totally adhere that these conquests are conquests of a civil society. 2 years ago in Paraguay, we published a book about the 70 years of Guarani, our local currency, which is, together with the Colombian peso, the two oldest currencies in South America. And the title said, 70 years of the Guarani, a conquest of society. And the truth is that public policies are always a conquest of society. And from the current administration, we have to ensure that society has a bigger role and participation in the building of those public policies. We're just passing through these functions, and our responsibility is how to raise the bar for those of us who come after us to do even better than we did. And the truth is that citizen participation will ensure that public policies are sustainable through time and their obtain a return for society.
Pues
Ministers, thank you very much for sharing with us your reflections. I think that you probably all agree with us that we couldn't have had a better start for Cuentas Claras seminar. Please join me to give our panelists a big round of applause. So we say goodbye to the ministers, Mr. Astori, Guy, and Peña, ministers of economy of Uruguay, Argentina, and Paraguay, respectively, and Jorge Familiar, of course, the vice president of the World Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean.